Has loving the right person ever led you down the most painful road? What price can someone pay for loving a king chosen by God? In this video you will discover the biblical story of Michal, the wife who loved David deeply, but whose loyalty and feelings led her to a destiny marked by sacrifice, silence, and tragedy. A little-told story, intense and full of spiritual meaning, that still leaves us with profound questions today. Have you ever wondered what the world was like in which Michal lived before love, politics, and tragedy shaped her destiny? To understand her story, it is essential first to enter the context of ancient Israel and the complex figure of her father, King Saul, a man chosen by God, yet trapped by his own fears. Israel, at that time, was not yet the powerful kingdom many imagine when reading the Bible. It was a people made up of tribes, united more by faith and shared memory than by a solid political structure. For generations, the Israelites had been governed by judges, charismatic leaders who arose in times of crisis, but there was no permanent monarchy. This lack of political unity made them vulnerable to neighboring peoples who did have organized armies and stable kings. Over time, the people began to look around and compare themselves. They saw other nations with visible kings, disciplined armies, and clear symbols of power. That comparison planted a deep desire. They wanted a king like the other nations. It was not only a political request, it was also a sign of spiritual insecurity. They wanted something tangible, someone they could see, someone who would lead their battles. The prophet Samuel warned the people about the consequences. A king would take their sons for war, their daughters to serve at court, would demand tributes, and would concentrate power. Even so, the people insisted. God then allowed the establishment of the monarchy, not as an ideal, but as a concession to human desire. Thus began a new stage in Israel's history. Saul was chosen to inaugurate that era. He came from the tribe of Benjamin, one of the smallest, and at first he seemed like the perfect candidate. He was tall, strong, attractive, and, outwardly, humble. When he was anointed, he even hid among the baggage, unable to believe that God had chosen him. That beginning awakened hope. He seemed like a man aware of his limits. The first years of his reign were marked by military victories and acceptable leadership. Saul defended Israel from its enemies and managed to unify, at least in appearance, the tribes. For the people, he represented security. For the court, power. For his family, prestige. It was in that environment that Michal was born and raised. Saul's house was not merely a family, it was the center of Israel's political power. To live there meant being surrounded by strategic decisions, alliances, rivalries, and constant expectations. The king's children did not have private lives in the modern sense. Each of their movements could have political implications. Michal grew up in an environment marked by tension between the spiritual and the political. Her father was king, but he also had to answer to God. Yet over time, Saul began to show signs of deep insecurity. The same man who at first appeared humble began to fear losing power. That fear grew quietly. One of the key moments that shaped Saul's reign was his disobedience. On several occasions, he acted impulsively, ignoring the divine instructions transmitted by Samuel. Each act of disobedience eroded his relationship with God, even though outwardly he still occupied the throne. The kingdom remained standing, but spiritually something was breaking. Samuel finally announced to Saul that God had rejected him as king. This did not mean immediate removal, but something deeper. His authority no longer had divine backing. Saul continued to rule, but he knew his reign was doomed. This revelation changed his character forever. From that moment, fear began to dominate him. He no longer ruled from confidence, but from suspicion. Every possible rival became a threat. Every sign of someone else's success stirred jealousy. The court, once a place of celebration, became a space heavy with tension. Michal grew up watching this change in her father. She saw how the strong king became unpredictable, how the silences lengthened, and how anger appeared without warning. The royal house ceased to be a safe refuge. Power had a high emotional cost, especially for those close to it. The figure of the king in Israel was not only political, it was also spiritual. Saul's behavior affected the entire people. When he drifted from God, the kingdom fell into confusion. That instability was reflected in the court, where decisions were made more out of fear than out of wisdom. In this context, the king's daughters, including Michal, were not free to decide their futures. Royal marriages were often used as political tools. Marrying a king's daughter could signify loyalty, alliance, or control. Love was rarely the priority. Michal, however, was not initially presented as a passive figure. The Bible mentions her as a woman with clear emotions and the capacity to decide, something uncommon in the narratives of the time. This makes her story even more striking, because it unfolds in an environment that profoundly limited the female voice. Saul's court was a place where appearance mattered as much as loyalty. Showing support for the king was essential for political survival. Yet that same court would witness the arrival of someone who would completely disrupt the balance of power, and Michal's heart. Before David entered the scene, Saul's house was already marked by a deep contradiction. They had the throne, but not peace. They had power, but not security. They had a dynasty, but no firm promise of continuity. In the midst of that fragility, Michal grew up, observed, and learned. Understanding this context is essential to understanding her later decisions. Michal did not love from freedom, but from pressure. She did not choose in a vacuum, but within a system that used people as strategic pieces. Her story cannot be separated from the story of her father and the kingdom he ruled. Israel was living a painful transition, from trusting fully in God to depending on human structures. Saul embodied that tension. And Michal, as the king's daughter, was caught in the middle of that invisible struggle. When the young David appears in this story, he will not arrive at a stable court, but at a wounded kingdom. He will not find a confident king, but a man dominated by fear. And he will not cross paths with a carefree princess, but with a woman who had already learned that loving in Saul's house could be dangerous. This was Israel in Michal's days, a kingdom with a crown, but without rest. A royal house full of outward honor and inner conflict. A perfect setting for love, when it appeared, to be neither simple nor safe, but profoundly costly. Here, in this house marked by insecurity of power and spiritual fragility, Michal's story truly begins. A story that cannot be understood without this context, because it was this world that shaped her choices, her love, and the high price she would eventually pay. Who was Michal really, beyond being known as David's wife and the daughter of a tormented king? To grasp the depth of her story, we need to pause over her identity, her character, and the complex place she held within Saul's house, where being a woman meant living between privilege and the absence of freedom. Michal appears in the biblical account as a singular figure. She is not presented only by her lineage, but also by her emotions. In a world where women rarely expressed personal feelings in the narrative, Michal stands out because the Bible clearly says that she loved David. This detail, seemingly simple, makes her one of the few women in Scripture whose love is explicitly mentioned. From the beginning, this tells us she was not a passive character. As King Saul's daughter, Michal grew up surrounded by material privilege, but also by constant tension. The royal house was not a common home. Every conversation could carry political implications, every visit could conceal a threat, and every personal decision was subordinate to the interests of the kingdom. In that environment, Michal learned from a young age that her life did not fully belong to her. Being a princess in Israel did not mean having power of her own. It meant being part of someone else's power. The king's daughters were seen as extensions of paternal authority, possible tools for strategic alliances or political moves. Their emotions, desires, and opinions were rarely considered priorities. Duty stood above the heart. Yet Michal was not described as indifferent or cold. On the contrary, her capacity to love, to take risks, and to act with courage reveals a strong character. This suggests that even within the limitations of her time, Michal developed a sense of self, her own way of seeing the world and relating to those around her. The Bible does not detail her childhood, but the context allows us to imagine her growing up in a court marked by her father's emotional instability. Saul was not always the same man. He moved from humility to paranoia, from obedience to rebellion, from security to constant suspicion. Michal was a silent witness to that transformation. Living with a father like that meant constantly adapting, learning when to speak and when to stay quiet, sensing mood shifts, anticipating reactions. That kind of environment often produces emotionally perceptive people, capable of reading complex situations. Michal likely developed this sensitivity, something that would later show in her decisions. It is also important to consider her place within the family. Michal was not Saul's only daughter, nor the only female figure at court. Yet she appears the most in the narrative, suggesting her story had a particular impact. She was not an anonymous princess. She was a woman whose life became deeply intertwined with the destiny of the kingdom. Unlike many biblical women who appear only in relation to motherhood, Michal is remembered for her role as wife, daughter, and critical observer. Her story does not revolve around children, but around decisions, loyalties, and emotional conflicts. This makes her a distinct figure within the biblical narrative. Her character is revealed especially in moments of crisis. When danger approaches, Michal neither flees nor freezes. Later, when David is at risk, she will act quickly and shrewdly. This shows a woman able to think under pressure, to challenge implicit orders, and to make choices that endangered her own safety. But before those moments, Michal was already a woman caught between two worlds. On one side, loyalty to her father and his house. On the other, her ability to see beyond imposed authority. That inner tension will define much of her story. The biblical account does not idealize her. Michal is not presented as perfect or entirely righteous. Later she will also show pride, resentment, and emotional distance. But precisely in that complexity lies her humanity. Michal is not a flat symbol. She is a character full of contradictions. Her identity was marked by the contradiction between what she felt and what was expected of her. Loving someone who was not politically convenient, being loyal in an environment where loyalty was monitored, thinking for herself in a structure that punished female autonomy. All of this shaped her character. Michal also represents many women silenced in ancient stories. Although her voice appears at key moments, much of her suffering happens outside the explicit text. There are long silences in her story, years in which we are not told what she felt, what she thought, or how she lived through imposed decisions. Those silences also speak. Her story invites us to read between the lines, to imagine what it meant to be given in marriage as part of a plan she did not design, to think about the emotional impact of loving and then being separated, to consider how other people's power shaped her fate without asking her. Michal was not a traditional heroine. She did not lead armies or deliver prophetic speeches. Her struggle was quieter, more internal, but no less real, the struggle to preserve identity in the middle of a system that constantly reduced her to a functional role. Her character also formed in contrast with other female figures in the narrative. While some biblical women appear as symbols of absolute faith or total submission, Michal appears critical, even confrontational. This makes her uncomfortable, but also deeply real. The Bible does not hide that Michal had opinions of her own and expressed them. This becomes especially evident later, when she publicly criticizes David. That ability to speak, even when it brings consequences, reinforces the idea that Michal was not voiceless, but rather a voice that was not always heard. Understanding who Michal was means recognizing that her identity was not built in freedom, but in resistance. She resisted expectations, silences, and other people's decisions. She resisted the weight of being daughter of a king rejected by God and wife of a man chosen by God. She lived between two powerful men without fully belonging to either. Her character was shaped by loss of control, of stability, of reciprocated love. Each of these losses left visible and invisible marks. And yet, Michal did not disappear from the account. Her name remains there, reminding us that her story mattered. When the Bible says Michal loved David, it is not a minor romantic detail. It is a narrative key. It shows that her story did not begin with convenience, but with genuine emotion. And that will make everything that follows more painful. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our next videos. Now, let's continue. Before being a wife, before being separated, before being judged, Michal was a woman who felt, observed, and decided within the limits imposed on her. Understanding her identity and character prepares us to grasp the depth of her later actions. Because when Michal loves, it will not be a naive love. It will be a love born in a hostile environment. And when she loses, it will not be a superficial loss. It will be the result of living an entire life in a house where power always took priority over the heart. This was Michal before her story became fully intertwined with David's, a complex, sensitive, and strong woman, formed in the tension of power and destined to pay a very high price for loving. What happens when God chooses someone no one expected and places him, without his knowing, at the center of a conflict that will change many lives? To understand Michal's story, it is essential first to understand who David was before becoming king, because his arrival at Saul's court not only altered Israel's political balance, but also the emotional destiny of those around him. David was not born in a palace or raised among privileges. He came from Bethlehem, from a simple family devoted to shepherding. He was the youngest of his brothers, and as such, the least regarded. While the older brothers prepared for war and public affairs, David cared for sheep, spent long days alone, and learned to observe nature, silence, and to trust God in small things. It was precisely in that anonymity that his character was formed. David learned to protect, to be patient, and to face dangers without witnesses. When he cared for the flock, he did not treat it as a lesser task, but as a sacred responsibility. In that time he developed an intimate faith, not ritualistic, but direct trust in God that would mark his whole life. The unexpected turn came when the prophet Samuel visited his father's house. God had rejected Saul as king and was now seeking someone after his own heart. David's brothers were presented one by one, strong, imposing, apparently ideal. But God chose none of them. Finally they called the youngest, the one no one had considered worth bringing in. When Samuel anointed David, there were no public celebrations or proclamations. It was a quiet, almost intimate act. David was anointed as future king, but no one explained when or how it would happen. From that moment on, he lived with an invisible promise over his head. He remained a shepherd, but he was no longer the same. David was not immediately taken to the throne. God allowed him to go through a long process. That process led him straight into the court of the rejected king. Saul, tormented by a troubling spirit, needed someone to play music to calm him. David, skilled with the harp, was called to serve. Thus David entered the royal house, not as a prince or heir, but as a servant. His presence was humble, but his effect was profound. When he played, Saul found relief. The young shepherd brought peace where unrest reigned. Without realizing it, David was already influencing the king's heart and the atmosphere of the court. But a specific event changed everything: the confrontation with Goliath. Israel was paralyzed by fear before the Philistine giant. No one dared face him. David, sent only to bring supplies to his brothers, heard the challenge and was indignant, not because of the danger, but because that man was defying the God of Israel. David did not see Goliath as an impossible enemy, but as someone who did not understand God's power. Armed only with a sling and his faith, he defeated the giant. The victory was immediate and spectacular. In a single moment, David went from anonymity to national fame. That triumph changed how everyone perceived him. The people celebrated him, the soldiers admired him, and the king began to look at him with a dangerous mixture of gratitude and fear. David became a symbol of hope for Israel, but also a threat to Saul. It was in this context that David began to occupy a stable place at court. He was given military responsibilities, and in every mission he succeeded. Everything he touched seemed to prosper. God's hand was clearly on him, and that did not go unnoticed. Songs began to spread: "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Those words, repeated joyfully by the people, pierced the king's heart like thorns. Saul began to compare himself, to measure his own worth against David's. And in that comparison, he lost his peace. David, for his part, was not trying to dethrone the king. He remained loyal, respectful, and aware of his place. He did not boast of his victory or demand recognition. But God's favor could not be hidden. And the more evident it became, the more Saul's resentment grew. Amid this tense environment, David began to relate to the royal family. That was where Michal saw him not only as a hero, but as a man different from the others. David did not only have courage in battle. He had sensitivity, faith, and a presence that stood out in a court dominated by fear. David represented a contrast. While Saul ruled from insecurity, David acted from trust. While the court moved by political strategy, he moved by obedience. That difference is what attracted many, and also what put him in danger. His relationship with Jonathan, Saul's son, reflects his character. Jonathan recognized David as God's chosen one and decided to support him, even knowing it would affect his own inheritance of the throne. This deep and sincere friendship shows that David was not a manipulator, but someone who inspired genuine loyalty. For Michal, watching David in this context must have been striking. He did not fit the traditional mold of the court. He did not compete for attention, he did not seek power, and yet everything seemed to gravitate toward him. His faith was not theoretical, it was lived. David was also a musician, poet, and sensitive man, not only a warrior. That combination of strength and tenderness was uncommon. In a house where power was expressed through violence and control, David offered a different form of leadership, even before becoming king. However, his presence also accelerated Saul's emotional downfall. The king began trying to kill him on several occasions. The royal house became a dangerous place for David. Each day was a test of patience, each night a threat. And yet David remained. He did not respond with violence. He did not conspire. He trusted that God would fulfill his promise in his time. That attitude made him even more incomprehensible to those who expected ambition and revenge. David was a man in transition, anointed but not crowned, called but not established, loved by some and hated by others. And without realizing it, he was about to enter a love story that would deeply mark Michal. Because David did not come into Michal's life as a powerful prince, but as a vulnerable man, persecuted and faithful to God. And that detail is key. Michal did not fall in love with the king David would become, but with the man David was in the midst of danger. Understanding who David was at this moment helps us understand the drama that will come later. His divine calling not only prepared him to rule, it also placed him at the center of conflicts that would affect those who loved him. This was David before the throne, an anointed shepherd, a brave warrior, a sensitive musician, and a man after God's own heart. And it was this David, not the glorious future king, who entered Michal's life and began a story where love, faith, and power would intertwine in painful ways. What happens when love is born in the least safe place, amid power, jealousy, and fear, and yet still finds a way through? The story of Michal and David's love does not begin as a strategy or a political agreement, but as a genuine feeling that arises in a court marked by distrust and constant tension. The Bible says it directly and unusually. Michal loved David. This brief but powerful statement breaks many patterns in the biblical narrative. We are not told she was handed over, or that she resignedly accepted, or that she simply obeyed an order. We are told she loved. That detail completely changes how we understand her story, because it presents Michal as an active emotional subject, not a decorative figure. For Michal, David was not only the hero who defeated Goliath. He was a man unlike the others in the court. While many lived seeking the king's approval, David seemed to move with a strange inner freedom. He did not need to prove his worth constantly, because his identity did not depend on human recognition. Saul's court was a place where glances were calculated and words measured. There was not much room for love there. Yet Michal observed David in that environment, and something about him stood out. His faith, his music, his way of acting without arrogance, everything contrasted with the fear that dominated the royal house. Michal's love did not begin in a romantic setting, but in a deeply dangerous one. David was already viewed with suspicion by King Saul. Each victory David won increased her father's resentment. Loving David, for Michal, was not a neutral choice. It placed her in a vulnerable position. This love was not hidden. The Bible says Saul learned that Michal loved David, and far from rejoicing, he saw an opportunity. For the king, his daughter's feelings became a tool. Where Michal saw love, Saul saw a possible trap. Here begins one of the most painful dynamics in the story. A daughter's sincere love is used by her father as part of a political strategy. Saul thought that by marrying Michal to David he could put him in danger, hoping he would die at the hands of Israel's enemies. The marriage, which should have been a refuge, became a weapon. For Michal, this moment must have been deeply confusing. On one hand, her love was returned in the sense that marriage became possible. On the other, that very marriage was surrounded by dark intentions. Nothing was simple in Saul's house, and love did not escape that logic. David, for his part, did not initially seek to marry a king's daughter. He even expressed feeling unworthy. His reaction was not ambition, but humility. This reinforces the idea that their bond did not arise from a desire for power, but from something more human. The price of the marriage was high and dangerous. Saul demanded a proof that involved mortal risk. He hoped David would not survive. But once again, David emerged victorious. What was meant to be his downfall became yet another confirmation that God was with him. The marriage between Michal and David took place, but it was not the happy ending we might imagine. From the beginning it was marked by tension, fear, and constant surveillance. Saul did not stop pursuing David. Michal's love now stood directly opposed to her father's hatred. Loving David meant living with the fear of losing him at any moment. It meant hearing rumors, feeling constant threat, watching the king's mood changes. Michal did not love from safety, but from anguish. And yet her love was not passive. When Saul decided to kill David, Michal did not hesitate. She risked her own life and position to save the man she loved. She helped him escape, deceived the king's messengers, and made a decision that would change her fate forever. That act of courage reveals the depth of her love. Michal chose David knowing it would set her directly against her father. She chose to protect rather than blindly obey. In a culture where family loyalty was sacred, Michal crossed a dangerous line. Saving David meant losing him. After helping him flee, Michal was left behind. David became a fugitive, and she remained in the king's house, alone, vulnerable, and exposed to the consequences of her decision. The love that moved her to act also left her in a place of profound abandonment. Here one of the most tragic aspects of her story is revealed. Michal loves, protects, and sacrifices, but does not receive protection in return. Her courage is not rewarded. Her loyalty is not honored. Instead, she is given to another man by her father's decision. This moment marks a deep rupture. The love that began with hope becomes forced loss. Michal has no voice in this decision. She is not asked, not consulted. She is treated like a piece that can be moved on the political chessboard. Michal's silence in this stage is eloquent. The Bible does not record her words, but it does record her circumstances. Years of separation, absence, a life she did not choose. All of this happens after she loved sincerely and acted with courage. The unexpected love between Michal and David was not a traditional romantic tale. It was a story marked by unequal power, imposed decisions, and painful consequences. And yet that love was real. It was not an illusion or a whim. It was a force that drove Michal to risk everything. This love also exposes the fragility of women in contexts of power. Michal loved, but could not decide. She protected, but was not protected. She chose, but others decided for her afterward. Her story shows that loving does not always guarantee justice or reciprocity. For David, this love also had consequences. The flight, the persecution, and the separation marked his life. But unlike Michal, he was able to move on, form new bonds, and build a future. Michal remained anchored in a story she could not close. Michal's love was genuine, but the world she lived in was not designed to protect that kind of love. It was designed to use it, manipulate it, and, if necessary, sacrifice it. When we read that Michal loved David, we are not looking at a secondary romantic note. We are looking at the beginning of a silent tragedy, and love that was born pure, but was trapped by fear, power, and the ambition of others. This unexpected love is the emotional heart of her story. Because everything Michal loses afterward has its root here. Loving David was not her mistake, but it was the beginning of the high price she would have to pay. And that is precisely why her story still resonates. Because many can identify with loving sincerely in contexts that do not allow that love to flourish. Because Michal did not love wrongly, she loved in the wrong place. This is how the love between Michal and David began, as an authentic spark in a hostile environment, and love that challenged power, expressed itself with courage, and, although it was not met with justice, left a deep mark on the biblical story. What happens when fear rules a king's heart and a daughter's love becomes a dangerous tool? In this section we enter one of the darkest and most revealing moments in Michal's story, when marriage ceases to be a personal bond and becomes a carefully designed trap. To understand this stage, we must look directly at King Saul's emotional state. Saul was no longer the humble man who had been anointed with hope. Now he lived dominated by jealousy, insecurity, and the constant fear of losing the throne. He knew God had rejected him and that someone else would take his place, even though he did not know when or how. That spiritual emptiness was filled by paranoia. Each of David's victories fed that fear. Each song from the people praising him was a direct wound to the king's ego. Saul did not see David only as a successful soldier, but as an existential threat. The young man who calmed his spirit with music had become, in Saul's mind, the man who would take everything from him. In that context, Saul began to think strategically, not from wisdom, but from fear. He had already tried to kill David directly, hurling his spear at him in moments of rage. But those attempts failed. David was still alive, protected by something Saul could not control. So the king sought a subtler way to eliminate him. That is where marriage entered the scene. Saul understood the power of family ties. A son-in-law was not only a family member, he was someone who could be exposed, manipulated, and placed in dangerous situations under the appearance of honor. Marrying David to one of his daughters could look like favor, but it actually hid a deadly intention. Saul had already promised his older daughter to David as a reward for his bravery. However, he broke that promise and gave her to another man. This first deception was not accidental. It clearly showed that the king had no intention of keeping his word when it came to David. The message was clear: David could not trust him. When Saul learned that Michal loved David, he saw a new opportunity. This time the move was even crueler because it directly involved his daughter's feelings. Michal's love became an instrument to draw David into a vulnerable position. Saul was not willing to protect his daughter from pain if it meant preserving his power. The marriage proposal came with a dangerous condition. Saul demanded a proof that involved confronting Israel's enemies in a nearly suicidal way. His hope was clear, that David would die in the attempt. If he fell in battle, Saul would be rid of his rival without staining his own hands directly. That detail reveals how far the king had crossed a moral line. He was not only willing to sacrifice David, but also to use his daughter as emotional bait. Marriage ceased to be a blessing and became a minefield. For Michal, this stage was especially painful. Her love, which had been born genuinely, was now caught in a web of manipulation. She likely did not know all of her father's intentions, but she certainly sensed the tension. Loving David meant living with constant fear. David, for his part, did not rush into the marriage with ambition. On the contrary, he expressed feeling unworthy to be the king's son-in-law. This matters because it shows David did not view marriage as social advancement, but as an enormous responsibility. He was not seeking power, he was trying to survive in a dangerous court. When David fulfilled Saul's demand and returned successfully, the king's plan failed once again. What was meant to be his downfall became another public demonstration that God was with him. Saul was forced to keep his word and give Michal to him as wife. But although the marriage took place, the trap did not disappear. David was now even more exposed. He lived under constant surveillance, surrounded by silent enemies, with a father-in-law who wanted him dead. The home that should have been a refuge was built on permanent threat. For Michal, marriage did not mean emotional security. Her father was still the king, her husband was the hunted man, and she was trapped between them. Each day she had to choose between silence and loyalty. Each night could be the last time she saw David alive. Saul did not stop trying to destroy David. Instead of relenting, he intensified the pursuit. Hatred grew alongside fear. The king's figure became more erratic, more violent, more unpredictable. The royal house became dangerous even for its own. At this point, Michal and David's marriage stops being a love story and becomes a survival story. Loving was no longer enough. One had to decide whom to be loyal to when loyalty carried irreversible consequences. Saul's trap was not only meant to kill David, it also meant to control Michal. By marrying her off, the king kept her under his sphere of influence. Even as a wife, she remained the king's daughter, placing her in an extremely vulnerable position. Any act of disobedience could be punished. This dynamic reveals something profound about abuse of power. Saul did not respect emotional or family boundaries. He saw his daughter as an extension of his strategy, not as a person with her own will. Michal's love was made invisible in the face of the king's fear. The Bible does not record private conversations between father and daughter at this moment, but the silence speaks for itself. There are no words of support, no protection, no comfort, only unilateral decisions. Michal was handed into a story she did not control. The marriage trap also affected public perception. For many, David now seemed part of the system. Married to the king's daughter, he could appear allied with power. Yet internally, his situation grew more dangerous. He was closer to the king, but also closer to danger. The contrast between Saul's intention and the outcome is striking. The king sought to destroy David, but every failed attempt reinforced the sense that God was protecting him. This did not lead Saul to repentance, but to even deeper hatred. Fear, when unaddressed, tends to grow. For Michal, this period marked the beginning of a fragmented life. Her marriage was born under the shadow of a trap. Her home was divided by opposing loyalties. Her love was threatened from the first day. Nothing in their relationship was simple or safe. This moment also shows a hard truth. Not all marriages in the Bible began as acts of blessing. Some began as consequences of wrong decisions, manipulation, and abuse of power. The account does not idealize this union. It presents it with harsh realism. Saul's trap was double. He wanted to kill David and control Michal. He failed at the first, but he deeply marked his daughter's life, because although David survived, Michal remained trapped in a story where her feelings were used against her. Here the price Michal would pay for loving begins to take shape. The love that bound her to David placed her at the center of a conflict she did not choose. The marriage that should have protected her exposed her. And the father who should have cared for her became the greatest threat to her stability. This section forces us to look beyond visible events. It is not only about a jealous king and a persecuted hero. It is about a woman whose love was instrumentalized by power, a daughter sacrificed emotionally to preserve a throne. The marriage trap did not end with the wedding. It was only the beginning of a series of losses Michal would have to face in silence. And although she did not yet know it, the love she had defended with courage was beginning to demand a price that no one was willing to pay on her behalf. Thus, Michal and David's marriage, far from being a story of stability, became an open wound, a union born of love, but manipulated by fear. And at the center of it all, a woman trapped between heart and power, between loyalty and survival. What would you do if, to save the person you love, you had to challenge the king, lie to your own father, and accept that you might never see your husband again? At this point in the story, Michal ceases to be only David's devoted wife and becomes a woman who acts with courage in the midst of danger, paying a price that will mark her life forever. The persecution against David was no longer a secret. King Saul had made a final decision. David had to die. What had once been outbursts of anger became a clear strategy. Messengers, guards, and precise orders began to surround the house where David lived with Michal. The danger was no longer abstract. It was at the door. Michal was the first to grasp the gravity of the situation. While others might still have doubted, she saw clearly that this time it was not a passing threat. Her father was not testing or intimidating. He was determined, and David, her husband, was the direct target. Here something fundamental happens for understanding Michal's character. She does not wait for David to realize it on his own. She does not freeze or retreat into silence. She acts. She confronts him with a hard, direct truth. If you don't flee tonight, tomorrow you will be dead. This is not an exaggeration. It is a warning born from intimate knowledge of her father's character. Saving David meant betraying Saul. There was no way to reconcile both loyalties. Michal understood that helping her husband meant definitively breaking with the obedience expected of her as the king's daughter. This was not a light decision. In a culture where loyalty to one's father and king was unquestionable, what Michal did was an act of enormous personal risk. The escape was not improvised. Michal thought quickly. She helped David flee through a window, probably at night, taking advantage of darkness and silence. There were no long farewells or reassuring promises. Time was running out. Every second counted. This moment is deeply symbolic. David, the warrior, the slayer of giants, flees without sword or army, aided by a woman who risks everything for him. Michal does not fight with weapons, but her courage is no less. Her battlefield is the necessary deception that saves a life. After helping David escape, Michal faces another immediate problem: explaining his absence. Saul's messengers would arrive soon. If they discovered the truth, she would be accused of treason. Here Michal shows not only love, but intelligence and composure under pressure. She places an object in the bed, covers it with clothing, and pretends David is sick. When the king's agents arrive, she lies. She says David is in bed, unable to get up. This lie is not random or impulsive. It is strategic, designed to buy time. When Saul insists and orders that David be brought even in his bed, the truth is exposed. The deception is revealed. David is already far away. The king's anger erupts, not against the fugitive, but against his own daughter. This confrontation between Saul and Michal is one of the harshest moments in the account. Saul does not see his daughter's act as a moral or emotional decision. He sees it as personal betrayal. He accuses her, humiliates her, and makes it clear that, in his eyes, she has chosen the enemy. Michal responds with a brief but revealing line. She says David threatened her, that he told her he would kill her if she did not help him. Some interpret this as a lie to protect herself, others as a way to minimize her responsibility before a furious father. Either way, it shows Michal understands the danger she faces and acts to survive. This moment marks a point of no return. Michal has saved David, but she is left alone. He flees, becomes a fugitive, and she remains in the king's house, exposed to the consequences. There is no immediate reward for her courage. No rescue. No protection. Here Michal's silence begins. For a long period, she disappears from the biblical narrative. David continues on, he flees, hides, gathers followers. His story moves forward. But Michal's story freezes at a point of forced abandonment. What happens next is one of the most painful aspects of her story. Saul, in an act of absolute control, gives Michal to another man. He does not do it out of love or care. He does it to erase David, to break any bond that still exists. Michal is torn from her marriage without having chosen it. This act is not only political, it is deeply personal. For Michal, it means losing her husband, losing her identity as a wife, and losing any possibility of deciding over her own life. All of this happens after she has shown extreme loyalty. The Bible does not tell us what that moment was like for Michal. It records no tears, no words, no protests. But the silence is eloquent, the silence of someone without power to resist, the silence of someone who has already given everything and receives nothing in return. Saving David cost her her place, her security, and her immediate future. While he remained alive and moved forward toward his destiny, she was trapped in a life she did not choose. The contrast is harsh, but real. Michal's heroic act does not make her the protagonist of triumph, it makes her a victim of the consequences. This point forces us to rethink what we mean by courage. Michal did not fight to gain recognition. She fought to save a life. And in doing so, she lost her own life as she knew it. Her courage was not celebrated, it was punished. It also shows an uncomfortable truth. Doing the right thing does not always bring immediate justice. In many biblical stories, acts of faith lead to blessing. In Michal's story, they lead to dispossession. This does not invalidate her action, but it makes it more human and more painful. Michal does not save David expecting reward. She does it because she loves him. And that love leads her to cross a line that cannot be undone. Once David flees, she cannot go back. Her relationship with her father is marked, her marriage destroyed, and her future uncertain. This episode also reveals Michal's isolation. No one intervenes for her. No one questions Saul's decision to give her to another man. Her sacrifice passes unnoticed for almost everyone, except the attentive reader who sees what the text does not explicitly say. While David flees into the wilderness, Michal remains in the palace, two destinies that split radically. One filled with danger but also movement and purpose, the other filled with forced stability but emptied of choice and love. This contrast helps us understand the wound Michal will carry for years. It is not only the loss of David, it is the loss of meaning. She acted with courage, and yet she was erased from the center of the story for a long time. Saving David was her freest act, and at the same time, the act that bound her most. Because by choosing to love and protect, she lost the right to choose her own path. This paradox runs through her entire story. When Michal later reappears in the account, she will no longer be the young woman in love who acts from the heart. She will be a woman marked by loss, silence, and injustice, changed not by wickedness, but by unhealed wounds. This moment of courage defines Michal forever, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. She chose to love when loving was dangerous. She chose to protect when protecting carried an enormous cost. And she chose to act when staying silent would have been safer. Saving David did not save her. And that is one of the hardest truths in her story. But it is also what makes her figure so powerful and so relatable. Michal is not remembered for winning, but for loving to the limit. In this quiet act, without crowds or applause, Michal showed a strength many warriors never displayed. She did not wield a sword, but she challenged the king. She did not deliver speeches, but she made an irreversible decision. Thus the woman who loved David became the woman who saved him, even knowing that love would cost her almost everything. And in that sacrifice, the tragedy that would shape the rest of her life begins to take root. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our next videos. Now, let's continue. What happens to a woman when the love she defended with courage is ripped from her life without explanation, without goodbye, and without any chance to respond? In this stage of the story, Michal enters the longest and most silent period of her life. Forced separation, narrative oblivion, and an existence shaped by decisions others made for her. After helping David escape, Michal is left completely exposed. The immediate danger has passed for him, but for her it has only begun. David flees, becomes a fugitive, and his story keeps moving forward. Michal, by contrast, remains in her father's house, alone, watched, and without emotional protection. The Bible is silent about those first days, but that silence is heavy. Michal had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. She had disobeyed the king, deceived his messengers, and chosen to save her husband, knowing that doing so would place her in direct opposition to Saul. Now she had to face the consequences without the support of the one for whom she had risked everything. Saul did not hesitate to act. For him, David's escape was not only a political threat but a personal humiliation. And Michal, far from being seen as a wounded daughter, was treated as an extension of the problem. The king decided to erase David from his daughter's life in the most definitive way possible, by giving her to another man. This act is not presented as an explicit punishment, but it is one in every sense. Michal is legally and socially separated from David and given in marriage to another man. Her consent is not recorded. No ceremony is mentioned. We are simply told that she was given. Once again, Michal is moved like a piece on a board she does not control. Here begins one of the most painful parts of her story. Michal does not only lose her husband, she loses her identity. In a culture where female identity was deeply tied to marriage, being torn from that union also meant losing the place she had built, even if with great difficulty. The Bible mentions that the man to whom she is given loves her. This detail, far from easing the tragedy, makes it more complex. Because love does not always compensate for the absence of choice. Being loved by another does not erase the fact that she was forced into a life she did not choose. Michal then enters a life she did not ask for. She lives with a man who was not her choice, carrying a past she cannot openly speak about. Her story is suspended. She is no longer David's wife, but she is not free either. She is a woman trapped in an endless transition. During this time, the biblical narrative focuses almost exclusively on David. We see him flee, hide, form alliances, write psalms, and grow stronger through adversity. His path, though hard, has movement and purpose. Michal's path, by contrast, falls outside the spotlight, not because it is unimportant, but because many women's stories in the Bible unfold on the margins. This narrative silence does not mean that nothing happens. It means that it happens outside the reader's view. Years pass. Michal grows older. She learns to live in a marriage she did not choose, in a house that does not feel like her own, with a story she cannot bring to closure. Time does not automatically heal. Sometimes it only accumulates wounds. Meanwhile, the conflict between Saul and David continues. Saul sinks deeper into despair. David gains recognition, followers, and eventually, after Saul's death, the throne. The balance of power shifts completely. It is at this point that Michal reappears in the narrative, and her return is neither romantic nor restorative. David, now consolidating his reign, demands that Michal be returned to him. He does not do so in the name of love, but of right and political legitimacy. Reclaiming Saul's daughter strengthens his position as king. This moment is deeply ambiguous. On the one hand, Michal is removed from the marriage into which she had been forced. On the other, she is once again treated as an object of political exchange. Once again, her voice is not mentioned. We do not know whether she wished to return to David or whether time had changed her feelings. The account includes a detail that is deeply moving. The man with whom Michal had lived follows her, weeping as she is taken away. This human detail contrasts sharply with the political coldness of the act. Michal is once again separated, this time from someone who truly loved her, to return to a story that was never resolved. Here an uncomfortable truth is revealed. Michal never had control over her relationships. She was given, then taken back. Loved, then torn away. Her emotional life was always decided by others, even when those others were men who claimed to act according to the law or the will of God. The reunion between Michal and David is not described as a celebration. There are no words of affection, no gestures of reconciliation. The silence persists. They are no longer the young lovers from Saul's court. They are people marked by years of separation, pain, and unilateral decisions. Michal returns as a wife, but not as a restored companion. Something has been broken. The love that once led her to save David's life is not mentioned. There is no recognition of her sacrifice. She returns, but she is not seen. This long period of silence and separation explains much of the character Michal will later display. It is not resentment without cause. It is the result of having been repeatedly stripped of her voice, her choices, and her story. The Bible does not romanticize this process. It does not present Michal as someone who simply waits patiently to be restored. On the contrary, it shows a woman who reappears with evident emotional distance, with a critical gaze, with words that reveal deep wounds. During the years of separation, Michal learned a painful lesson. Loving does not guarantee protection. Being loyal does not ensure justice. And doing what is right does not always bring visible reward. These experiences do not harden the heart without reason. They protect it. It is important to note that Michal's silence is not passivity. It is survival. In a system that does not allow her to speak, silence becomes a form of resistance. She remains alive, she continues to exist, even though the narrative does not center her. This stage of her life forces us to look closely at the characters who disappear from the main focus. Not everything important happens on the battlefield or on the throne. Some of the deepest stories unfold in waiting, loss, and forced adaptation. Michal did not choose this separation, but she had to live it. She did not choose this silence, but she learned to inhabit it. And when she finally reappears, she does so as a transformed woman, not because she stopped loving, but because she learned how costly it is to love in a world governed by power. This section of the story is key to understanding the final rupture between Michal and David. Without these years of forced separation, her later reaction might seem exaggerated. But seen in light of everything she lost, it makes sense. Michal was not forgotten by God, but she was ignored by the system. Her story does not unfold through visible miracles, but through everyday resistance. And that makes her deeply human. At the end of this long silence, Michal returns to David's life, but the woman who returns is not the one he once helped escape through a window. Someone different comes back. Someone who has learned that love without a voice becomes a wound. This is the stage where Michal's heart changes forever. Not because she chose to harden it, but because no one can pass through years of loss without being transformed. And so, amid unwritten silences and imposed decisions, Michal pays a price that is rarely mentioned but weighs more than any visible punishment: living a life she was never fully able to choose. What happens when power brings someone back into your life, not to heal the past, but to fulfill a political purpose? At this stage of the story, the reunion between Michal and David takes place, not as an act of restored love, but as a decision charged with symbolism, power, and wounds that were never healed. With the death of King Saul, Israel enters a new era. The long conflict that marked the previous reign comes to an end, and gradually David is recognized as king. He first rules over Judah and, in time, consolidates his authority over all Israel. The persecuted shepherd finally becomes the promised monarch. This rise was neither immediate nor simple. David had to navigate fragile alliances, tribal tensions, and internal conflicts. Governing a divided kingdom required not only military strength, but political legitimacy. And in that context, the past came knocking once again. Michal, Saul's daughter, represented a direct link to the former royal house. Reclaiming her as his wife was not merely a personal matter, but a strategic act. By doing so, David strengthened his claim to the throne and demonstrated continuity between the old and the new regime. The decision carried symbolic weight, and David knew it. That is why, when he negotiates with leaders who still support Saul's house, David sets a clear condition, that Michal be returned to him. He does not ask for gold or land. He asks for his wife. The gesture is forceful, but also deeply ambiguous. The Bible does not say that David asked for Michal out of love. Nor does it record any prior conversation between them. The text is restrained, almost cold. Michal is returned because she legally belongs to him, not because there is an attempt to restore a relationship broken by years of silence, loss, and decisions made by others. Michal's transfer is one of the most moving moments in the narrative. The man with whom she had lived for years follows her, weeping, walking behind her until he is ordered to turn back. This brief but powerful scene shows the human cost of political decisions. Michal is once again torn away, this time from someone who truly loved her and with whom she had built a life, even if she had not chosen it initially. This return is not an emotional victory for Michal. It is another uprooting, another rupture, another forced transition. Her life changes direction once again without her voice being recorded. Once more, others decide for her. When Michal returns to David's house, no intimate reunion is described. There are no words of forgiveness, no shared memories, no gestures of affection. The silence continues. Time has not healed the wounds, it has only buried them deeper. David, now king, is a different man from the young fugitive who escaped through a window. He has power, authority, multiple wives, and a clear sense of mission. His life is filled with responsibilities and conquests. Michal, by contrast, returns carrying a history of accumulated losses and without a clear place in this new order. Here begins a coexistence marked by distance. Michal is no longer the loving wife who risked everything to save him. Nor is she the princess of Saul's court. She is a woman who has lived through years of separation, silence, and lack of control over her own destiny. David is no longer the man she loved either. The king has learned to rule, to negotiate, to impose. His relationship with God remains deep, but his life is now surrounded by power and ceremony. The intimacy they once shared seems to have no place in this new setting. Michal's return, far from reuniting them, exposes the distance that time and imposed decisions have created. They occupy the same space, but no longer share the same inner world. What once united them is no longer enough to rebuild what was destroyed. This forced reunion reveals a hard truth. Not everything that is recovered is restored. There are relationships that, even when formally reunited, can no longer be what they once were. The damage is not always visible, but it runs deep. Michal returns to a house where she has no power or influence. David rules, decides, and celebrates. She observes. The biblical narrative does not show her actively participating in the political or religious life of the kingdom. Her role is peripheral, almost silent, but her presence remains significant. This period prepares the ground for the final conflict between them. The accumulated silence, unspoken wounds, and lack of recognition for Michal's sacrifice slowly turn into emotional distance. It is not immediate hatred, it is disconnection. David appears to move forward without looking back. Michal carries a past that was never validated. She loved, saved, lost, and was given away. Now she returns, not as the protagonist of a story of restoration, but as a symbol of political legitimacy. This contrast is essential to understanding her story. David, though a man after God's own heart, is not portrayed as perfect in his human relationships. His spiritual greatness does not erase emotional failures or the consequences of past decisions. Michal's return also shows how power can redefine relationships. What was once a bond of love and shared risk is now a union marked by hierarchy. David is king. Michal is one of his wives. Emotional equality no longer exists. The Bible does not explicitly condemn David for this decision, but neither does it celebrate it. The text leaves space for reflection. It allows us to see that even legally correct decisions can be emotionally destructive. Michal is once again close to David, but she is not truly seen. There is no mention of shared children, common projects, or a rebuilt life. The silence continues, now heavy with resentment and distance. This reunion also raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when someone who owes you their life never acknowledges your sacrifice? The story does not record David thanking Michal for saving him. There is no tribute, no emotional restitution. She returns, but her heroic act remains in the past, unspoken. The absence of recognition weighs heavily, not because Michal sought glory, but because prolonged silence turns sacrifice into a wound. To love and save, only to be forgotten, leaves deep marks. Michal's return is, in many ways, the beginning of the end of her emotional story with David. Not because she stops feeling, but because she understands that the love that once drove her no longer has a place in this new reality. This moment reminds us that not all returns are happy. Some only confirm what has been lost. Others reveal that time, far from uniting, has permanently separated. Michal returns to David's life not as a restored wife, but as a figure embodying everything that was sacrificed in the name of power, politics, and destiny. Her silent presence is a constant reminder of an unresolved past. And so, while David consolidates his kingdom and writes new chapters of his story, Michal prepares, without knowing it, for the moment when that silence will break. Because unspoken wounds do not disappear. They accumulate. This reunion without love, without words, and without healing sets the stage for the final conflict. A conflict born not of a single moment, but of years of loss, imposition, and silence. Michal's return was not the happy ending many might expect. It was the return of a woman to a story that never fully protected her. And in that return, it became clear that power can reunite bodies, but it cannot always restore hearts. What happens when a wound kept for years finally finds an occasion to speak, and does so at the least expected moment? The episode of the Ark and the definitive rupture between Michal and David is not a simple domestic disagreement. It is the silent explosion of everything that was never said, everything that was lost, and a love story that ended in irreversible distance. The setting is solemn and filled with meaning. David, now firmly established as king, decides to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark represents the presence of God among the people, the spiritual center of Israel. It is no ordinary object. It is a symbol of covenant, divine guidance, and victory. The moment is historic, and David knows it. The city prepares for a great celebration. There is music, singing, instruments, and processions. The atmosphere is one of collective joy. David, deeply moved, gives himself fully to the celebration. He dances with all his might before the ark, dressed simply, without the royal garments that normally distinguish him. This detail is crucial. David does not dance as king, he dances as a worshipper. He sets aside the formality of power and presents himself, according to his conviction, humbly before God. For him, this act is a genuine expression of gratitude, faith, and recognition that his authority comes from something higher than the throne. While the people celebrate, someone watches from a window. Michal sees David from the palace. She is not in the procession. She does not dance. She watches. And what she sees does not bring her joy, but contempt. The biblical text is direct. Michal despised him in her heart. This contempt does not arise out of nowhere. It is not a superficial judgment or an impulsive reaction. It is the result of years of emotional distance, accumulated losses, and a relationship never restored. David's public act touches a deep wound in Michal, a wound that has been latent since her separation, her silence, and her forced return. When David comes home, still filled with joy, Michal confronts him. Her words are ironic, sharp, and charged with resentment. She reproaches him for exposing himself before the people, behaving, in her eyes, in a manner unworthy of a king. She does not speak from curiosity or a desire to understand, but from judgment. For Michal, David's dance is not humility, it is humiliation. It is not worship, it is a loss of dignity. And here a profound clash of visions is revealed. David sees the act as spiritual surrender. Michal sees it as a breach of royal decorum. They look at the same scene from completely different inner worlds. David responds firmly. He reminds her that he dances not to please people, but God. He affirms that God chose him over her father's house, and that he is willing to humble himself even more if it honors God. His words are theologically sound, but emotionally harsh. In this response there is spiritual truth, but also a relational fracture. David does not acknowledge Michal's pain. He does not validate her story. He does not mention the sacrifice she made in saving his life. Instead, he affirms his calling and divine election, creating even greater distance. For Michal, these words do not merely wound, They confirm something she may have already sensed, that her place in David's life has been replaced by something greater, more visible, more powerful. She loved a persecuted man. Now she lives with a king who does not look back. This moment is the final break. There is no later reconciliation. There is no healing dialogue. The biblical text closes this scene with a stark statement. Michal had no children until the day of her death. This line has been interpreted in many ways, but its symbolic weight is undeniable. In the biblical context, the absence of children is not merely a biological condition. It is a sign of closure, relational barrenness, and the end of lineage. For Michal, it means her story does not continue, her voice is not inherited, her place fades silently. It is important to pause here and look carefully. The text does not explicitly say that God punishes Michal for her attitude. Nor does it state that her barrenness is a direct judgment. What it does show is that after this episode, Michal disappears from the narrative. Her story ends in silence. This final silence is deeply significant. Michal, who loved, saved, lost, was given away and brought back, ends without descendants and without recognition. Her life is marked by absence, not because she did not live intensely, but because the system she lived in did not know how to protect her. The contrast between David and Michal in this episode is intentional. David is celebrated for his devotion to God. Michal is remembered for her criticism. But this surface reading misses the full context. Michal does not criticize from frivolity, she criticizes from a wound. For her, David's dance comes from a place of power and freedom she never had. He can expose himself, humble himself, and be celebrated. She, by contrast, has been exposed without choosing, humiliated without honor, and silenced without repair. The window from which Michal watches is not only a physical place, it is a metaphor for her position in the story. She is inside the palace but outside the celebration. Close to power, but far from joy. A witness, but not a participant. David represents a faith expressed outwardly, with joy and freedom. Michal represents a wounded faith, trapped between duty and disappointment. Both relate to God, but their emotional paths no longer intersect. This episode does not invite us to choose a simple side. It invites us to see human complexity even in biblical stories. David can be a man after God's own heart and still fail to see the pain of the woman who loved him first. Michal can err in how she expresses her criticism and still carry deep, valid reasons. Michal's final barrenness can also be read as the result of a broken relationship, not necessarily as divine punishment. When a relationship dies emotionally, it ceases to produce life. There is no shared future, no common project. This ending is difficult because it offers no immediate comfort. There is no visible redemption for Michal. No poetic justice. There is silence, and that silence unsettles us because it breaks the expectation of happy endings. Yet that same silence makes her story powerful. Michal is not an idealized figure. She is a real woman, with complex emotions, courageous decisions, and painful consequences. Her story does not teach through victory, but through loss. The final break with David does not invalidate her past love. It does not erase her bravery. It does not negate the fact that she saved his life when no one else did. But it does show that not every sacrifice is recognized in one's lifetime. This episode also raises a deep question. What happens when one person's spirituality ignores another's wound? David celebrates God, but does not see Michal. Michal sees David, but cannot see his heart in that moment. They lose each other. Michal's story ends without reconciliation, making it different from many biblical narratives. There is no public restoration. No final miracle. There is a life that fades into silence. But that silence speaks. It speaks of women who loved and were forgotten. Of those who did what was right and paid a high price. Of those left outside the celebration, watching from the window. The ark enters Jerusalem with joy. David dances. The people celebrate. And somewhere in the palace, Michal remains alone with her story. That contrast is intentional. It reminds us that the spiritual advance of a community does not always coincide with the emotional healing of all its members. The rupture between Michal and David is not merely a marital conflict. It is the closing of a story that began with genuine love and ended in irreversible distance, a closing that does not shout, but weighs heavily. And so, the woman who loved David, who protected him when no one else did, ends her story not in triumph, but in silence. A silence that forces us to listen more carefully, read with greater empathy, and remember that behind the great biblical names are deeply human lives. This is the moment when Michal disappears from the narrative, but not from memory. For her story, though brief in words, is vast in meaning. And in that final rupture, we understand that the price she paid for loving was truly very high. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our next videos. Now, let's continue. What invisible price can someone pay for loving with loyalty in a world where power decides who matters and who is silenced? In this section, we pause to look at Michal's final destiny, not as a simple biblical ending, but as the cumulative result of others' decisions, unhealed wounds, and a life marked by the loss of control over her own path. After the definitive break with David, Michal disappears from the narrative. There are no more words from her, no final scenes, no farewells. The Bible mentions her one last time to state that she had no children until the day of her death. This brief, stark phrase has been interpreted for centuries as judgment, punishment, or consequence. But to grasp its true weight, we must view it in light of the entire story that precedes it. Michal is not presented as barren from the beginning. Her barrenness appears at the end, after years of separation, imposed silence, and a broken relationship. This matters, because it shifts us away from a simplistic reading of divine punishment and invites us to consider a deeper, relational, and symbolic barrenness. In the biblical context, having children was not only a personal blessing. It was continuity, legacy, memory. Not having them meant that a person's story faded without descendants. In Michal's case, as the daughter of Israel's first king, this absence carries even greater weight. Saul's house ends with her. Her lineage does not continue. But beyond the national symbolism, there is a deeply human dimension. Michal loved, protected, and sacrificed, but she was never able to build a future of her own. Every bond she had was decided or interrupted by others. She was a wife, then she was not. She was given away, then brought back. She lived in marriages without full choice. That lack of autonomy is ultimately reflected in a life that produces no visible fruit. Michal's barrenness can be understood as the result of a story in which there was never a safe space for intimacy, trust, and healing. A broken emotional life rarely bears fruit. When love is constantly threatened, manipulated, or silenced, it becomes difficult for anything new to flourish. It is crucial to note that the biblical text does not celebrate this barrenness. It does not present it as moral victory or example. It simply states it, leaving the reader with a sense of emptiness. And that emptiness is intentional. It forces us to pause, to feel discomfort, to ask what went wrong along the way. Michal paid a high price for loving, not once, but repeatedly. First, by loving David in a house ruled by fear. Then, by saving his life in defiance of her father. After that, by being separated and given to another man. Later, by being returned for political reasons. Finally, by being emotionally ignored when her wound surfaced. Each of these moments left marks. None were explicitly healed. There is no record of restoration, accompaniment, or repair. Michal lives with the consequences, but without space to process them. Compared to other female biblical figures, Michal's story is different. It is not a story of visible redemption or celebrated transformation. It is a story of erosion. And precisely for that reason, it feels so close to many people today. Not all stories end with evident miracles. Some end with silences that weigh more than words. By including Michal's fate without embellishment, the Bible acknowledges that reality. It does not hide it or soften it. It is also important to recognize that Michal is never explicitly condemned by God in the text. There is no prophecy against her, no direct divine rebuke. Her destiny appears instead to be the outcome of a system that failed to protect or value her. Political power, patriarchy, and war played central roles in her life. Michal lived among powerful men, a father king consumed by fear and a husband king consumed by his calling. Between them, she was left without a space of her own. Her final barrenness can also be seen as a metaphor for the definitive rupture between Michal and David. A relationship that was never restored cannot produce life. The conflict of the ark was not an isolated event. It was the final expression of a distance that already existed. David moved on. He had other children, other wives, other stories. Michal did not. Not because she was less valuable, but because her story was trapped in a dynamic that did not allow her to move forward in the same way. Here an uncomfortable question arises. Can someone be used by God and still fail deeply in caring for the one who loved them first? Michal's story suggests that yes, spiritual greatness does not immunize against emotional blindness. This does not turn David into a villain or Michal into an absolute martyr. Both are human. Both carry limitations. But the asymmetry of power between them means that the cost falls almost entirely on her. Michal ends her story without a voice, but not without meaning. Her final silence is an implicit indictment. It shows what happens when sacrifice is not acknowledged, when loyalty is not protected, and when love becomes a bargaining chip. For many readers, Michal's fate feels unjust. And perhaps that is the point. The Bible does not always offer endings that comfort us. Sometimes it presents realities that force us to reflect on our own power structures, decisions, and omissions. Michal teaches us that loving does not always guarantee a happy ending. That doing what is right can bring painful consequences. And that faith, when not accompanied by empathy and care, can leave silent victims. Her story also speaks of women who remain outside the spotlight, those who support, save, and sacrifice, but receive no recognition. Those who pay prices no one sees. The absence of children in Michal's life does not define her worth. It defines her loss. It defines what was denied to her. It defines the cost of living in a system that prioritized power over people. In the end, Michal is remembered not for a public achievement, but for a private loyalty. Not for a visible victory, but for a love that was not rewarded. And that makes her profoundly human. Her destiny invites us to look more carefully at stories that do not end well, to avoid spiritualizing others' pain, to stop justifying silence as divine will when it may be the result of human injustice. Michal paid a very high price for loving, not because loving was a mistake, but because the world in which she loved was not prepared to protect that love. Her life ended without descendants, but her story continues to bear fruit in those willing to read it with empathy. Because sometimes the stories that teach us the most are not the ones that triumph, but the ones that hurt. And Michal's story, in its final silence, continues to speak to us with a force that crosses the centuries. What can such an ancient story, marked by love, silence, and loss, teach us today, in a world still struggling with the same dilemmas of the human heart? Michal's story does not end when she disappears from the biblical narrative. In fact, that is where her deepest dialogue with us begins, because her life forces us to reflect on love, faith, power, and the invisible cost of being faithful to one's heart in contexts that do not protect it. The Bible does not present Michal's story as a simple example of right or wrong behavior. It is not a moral parable with easy answers. It is a human story, full of nuance, where no one emerges unscathed and where right decisions do not always receive immediate reward. Precisely for that reason, her story remains so relevant. One of the first lessons Michal leaves us is that loving is not always safe. We are often taught that true love will be protected, honored, and blessed. But Michal's life shows a harsher reality. One can love sincerely and still be wounded, displaced, and silenced. Love does not always unfold in just settings. Michal loved David when he had no power, when he was persecuted and vulnerable. Her love was not opportunistic or strategic. It was a love expressed through actions, not words. She did not merely feel, she acted. She risked her position, her safety, and her future. That way of loving is deeply valuable, even if the world does not always recognize it. From a spiritual perspective, Michal's story invites us to question the idea that faith always protects us from loss. Michal believed, acted courageously, and chose what was right according to her conscience. Yet her life did not end in visible fulfillment. This does not invalidate her faith. It reveals that faith is not a protection contract, but a path that sometimes passes through pain. Her story also teaches us something uncomfortable about power. Both her father and her husband were men chosen by God at different times, and yet both failed profoundly in caring for her. This reminds us that a high spiritual position does not guarantee emotional maturity or relational justice. Being used by God does not mean being blameless with people. Michal's story warns us against idealizing biblical characters. Scripture does not hide the cracks. It shows us spiritual leaders capable of great acts of faith and, at the same time, of great emotional omissions. This honesty invites us to read with discernment and empathy. Another profound reflection has to do with silence. Much of Michal's story unfolds off-stage. Entire years are not narrated. We do not know how she processed the separation, how she lived the imposed marriage, or how she received the order to return to David. That silence is not irrelevant. It represents all those whose stories are not fully told, but whose experiences are real. Spiritually, Michal's silence reminds us that God sees even what is not narrated. A story lacking focus does not lack value. Many faithful lives do not receive public recognition, but that does not make them invisible to God. The final confrontation between Michal and David also leaves an important lesson. Spirituality that does not listen to another's pain can become harsh. David was celebrating a genuine encounter with God, but he did not see the wound of the woman beside him. This invites us to reflect on how we live our faith in relation to others. Authentic faith is not expressed only toward God, it is also translated into care, listening, and sensitivity toward those who have walked with us. When worship ignores nearby suffering, something breaks. Michal's story calls us to integrate spirituality and empathy. On a personal level, Michal speaks to those who have loved without being protected, to those who did what was right and still lost, to those who were loyal and received no recognition. Her story validates that pain without justifying it or spiritualizing it away. She also teaches us that resentment does not appear out of nowhere. Michal's harsh judgment of David in the Ark episode is not a whim. It is the final expression of years of accumulated silence. This reminds us of the importance of healing wounds before they become irreversible distance. From a spiritual reading, Michal's destiny should not be understood as a warning against loving, but as a warning against systems that fail to care for those who love. The problem was not her love, but the context in which she had to live it. The Bible does not tell us to imitate Michal's ending, but it does invite us to learn from it, to create relationships where sacrifice is recognized, loyalty is not exploited, and faith does not justify emotional abandonment. Another key lesson is the importance of voice. Michal was repeatedly silenced. Decisions were made for her. Her story reminds us how necessary it is to listen to those who are often pushed to the margins. In a contemporary reading, her figure calls us to make space for voices that power tends to ignore. Spiritually, Michal represents those who do not receive visible restoration in this life, yet whose story still holds value. Not all biblical stories end with material or familial restitution. Some end with quiet dignity, and that dignity is also sacred. Her life forces us to rethink the idea of spiritual success. Michal had no descendants, no visible legacy, no celebration. And yet her story has crossed centuries, touching hearts and provoking reflection. Sometimes fruit is neither immediate nor tangible, but it exists. Michal's story also teaches us to look with greater compassion at family conflicts. It reminds us that emotional damage does not always heal with time, that unaddressed wounds transform, and that love without care erodes. From a pastoral or devotional perspective, her story can be a space of comfort for those who feel they gave more than they received, for those who feel their faithfulness was not valued. The Bible does not minimize that pain. It records it, even if only in silence. Finally, Michal's story invites us to look at God beyond visible outcomes, to trust that He sees what others overlook, and to believe that no faithful life is useless, even if it does not end in a way the world calls successful. Michal is remembered not for what she had, but for what she gave, not for a lineage, but for an act of love that saved a life. And although that love cost her almost everything, it was not in vain. Her story challenges us to love wisely, to exercise power carefully, and to live faith with empathy. It reminds us that behind every great biblical figure are real people, with real emotions, paying real prices. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all, that God works not only in stories of victory, but also in stories of loss, not only in names that fill chapters, but also in those that fade into silence. Michal, the wife who loved David and paid a very high price, still speaks to us today. Not to give easy answers, but to invite us into a more human, more compassionate faith, one that is aware of the cost that loving can sometimes entail. Why does a woman like Michal, who appears so little in the Bible, continue to stir so many questions, reflections, and emotions centuries later? The answer is that her story represents a voice long read in silence, but now increasingly heard, especially when we read Scripture through the lenses of memory, justice, and compassion. Michal is one of those biblical figures who does not deliver great speeches or perform visible miracles, yet whose life contains a depth that emerges only when read carefully. For centuries, her story was interpreted hastily, often reduced to a critical, proud, or punished woman. A closer reading, however, reveals something very different: a woman trapped between power, love, and silence. Michal is a forgotten voice because the biblical narrative, like many ancient accounts, was transmitted in contexts where women's experiences were not always central, not because they were unimportant, but because the focus was on kings, battles, and political decisions. Even so, the text preserves enough detail to ensure her story is not completely lost. When we view Michal from a contemporary perspective, her life becomes strikingly familiar. She loved, was loyal, acted courageously, and still ended up marginalized. This experience is not foreign to many people today. That is why her story resonates. It is not distant or alien, it is deeply human. Remembering Michal is an act of narrative justice. It is refusing to read the Bible only through its most visible names and choosing instead to pay attention to those on the margins. Her story teaches us that the absence of prominence does not equal the absence of meaning. Michal also invites us to rethink how we read biblical silences. The fact that the text does not record her thoughts for long periods does not mean they did not exist. It means we must read between the lines, with empathy and responsibility. Michal's silence is not empty, it is filled with loss, adaptation, and resistance. In this sense, Michal becomes a symbol of many voices unheard in their time: women, wives, daughters who lived under others' decisions, whose sacrifices were not celebrated, but without whom many stories would not have been possible. David lives because Michal acted. And yet she is not remembered as a savior, only briefly mentioned. Her story also forces us to reflect on how we treat those who loved first, those who were present before success, before recognition, before power. Michal loved David when he was persecuted, not when he was king. That difference matters. Loving before glory is often more costly and less rewarded. Reading Michal today is also an invitation to revisit traditional interpretations. For a long time, her criticism of David was seen as spiritual irreverence. But when her entire life journey is considered, that criticism can be understood as the final expression of a deep wound, not a rejection of God, but an unresolved human fracture. This does not mean idealizing Michal or justifying every action she took, but recognizing her complexity. The Bible does not present flat characters. It shows people with contradictions, emotions, and limits. Michal is no exception. Her story teaches us that faith and pain can coexist. In a time that seeks to amplify silenced voices, Michal becomes especially relevant. She reminds us that sacred history is made not only of victories, but also of losses, and that both are part of the human journey before God. Michal's memory also challenges us as readers and believers. Whom are we leaving out of our interpretations? What stories are we overlooking because they do not fit triumphalist narratives? What voices are we still silencing, even today? Remembering her is an act of compassion. It is recognizing that not all faithful lives end with visible restoration. Some end in silence, and that silence does not make them less valuable. On the contrary, it makes them witnesses to a faith that does not depend on applause. Michal left no descendants, but she left a story that continues to bear fruit, not in lineages, but in awareness. Her life teaches us to look more carefully, judge more slowly, and listen more deeply. When the Bible chooses to include her name, even briefly, it tells us something important. Her story deserved to be remembered. And every time we return to it, we restore a bit of the voice she did not have in her own time. Thus, Michal ceases to be merely David's wife and becomes a figure who invites us to read Scripture with more human eyes, to understand that faith does not erase pain, but can give it meaning when read honestly. Her story matters because it reminds us that God also walks with those who do not win, who are not celebrated, who remain outside the procession. It matters because it teaches us that loving can carry a high cost and still be a worthy act. By bringing Michal to the center of reflection, we do not change the biblical text, we listen to it more carefully. And in listening to her, we also learn to listen to those who live similar stories today. Perhaps that is why Michal still speaks to us. Because her voice, though faint in the text, is strong in meaning. Because her story does not seek to close with answers, but to open questions that still need to be asked. And in that act of remembering, naming, and reflecting, Michal ceases to be a forgotten voice and becomes a recovered one, a voice that does not shout, but endures. A voice that invites us to a more conscious, more just, and more compassionate faith. Thus her story ends in the Bible, but not her impact. For as long as there are readers willing to look beyond the obvious, Michal will continue to be remembered, not only for what she lost, but for the depth with which she loved. Michal's story reminds us that the Bible is also made of silences, unrewarded loves, and people who gave much without receiving the same in return. If this journey helped you see her story with new eyes, we invite you to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring biblical narratives that are deep, human, and full of meaning. Like the video if this story made you reflect, and tell us in the comments which part of Michal's life impacted you most or which biblical character you would like to explore in future videos. Your participation helps us continue giving voice to stories that deserve to be heard.